Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Inside Israel with Joel Chasnoff. That's me. Coming to you tonight from Marble Falls, Texas, the last broadcast from Marble Falls in a very long time. Marble Falls here in Central Texas, where the cows graze just about everywhere, but you also see Israeli flags flying in the breeze. They do support Israel out here. It's been a long day for me, but I'm psyched to be here. I'm seeing that my picture might be a little bit spotty, so write me in the chat if you're seeing me okay with the video. We are having some big storms out here in Texas, so if the video isn't coming through, we might have to do audio only for this one. But it's been a long day. Like I said, the day started in Norfolk, Virginia, where I had a show last night for Yom Ha'atzmaut, and then flew in today through Chicago, and now here back in Marble Falls, and a lot to talk about. I'm very excited to meet with you this evening because there really is a lot going on. Tonight's episode is called Gaza and Nature Both. Let that sink in. Gaza and nature both. And what I'm referring to is the idea that nature abhors a vacuum. This is a well-known scientific concept, I think originally attributed to Aristotle, but the idea is that when there is an empty space that is not filled, nature will rush in to fill that empty space. And why is that the title of tonight's episode? Well, I think Israelis are waking up to the idea that there is a vacuum in Gaza, and it's not merely an idea or a statement, but that there are actual consequences for the fact that there is a vacuum in Gaza right now. And I think the incident that led to Israelis feeling this is the death of 5 Israeli soldiers just about 24 hours ago in Gaza. And in a moment, I'll go into the circumstances of how they died and explain how that relates to this idea of there being a vacuum in Gaza and Israelis really realizing it and feeling it. So let's start with the first of 3 narratives related to this idea of a vacuum in Gaza. The first is about Yoav Gallant. Yoav Gallant, as you may remember from previous episodes, is the Minister of Defense in Israel. I'll give you a little bit of background about him. He is a member of the Likud party. So this is Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister's party. They're both members of Likud. But Gallant, I wouldn't say he hates Netanyahu, but maybe you could go ahead and say that. He hates Netanyahu. There is definitely bad blood between them. That's how the media describes it, as bad blood between them. They do not get along. And there are a few reasons why. We can trace everything really back to March of 2023. So that's just about 14 months ago exactly. What happened in March 2023? Well, it feels like a long time ago in the past, but Israel was embroiled in this idea of attempted judicial reform. This is where Netanyahu was really trying to change the rules about how judges are selected in Israel. And this led to really a deep division in Israeli society along many lines, religious and secular, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, higher socioeconomic income, lower socioeconomic. Those in the West Bank and Gaza, not Gaza, but those in the West Bank and calling for resettlement of Gaza, and those more of the secular Israeli who wanted to pursue peace with the neighbors. So Israeli society was very torn and really on the brink of a civil war because of these judicial reform attempts by Netanyahu. And in March 2023, the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, came out and gave a speech where he was very clear. And he said that this judicial reform plan put out by Netanyahu is threatening the security of the state of Israel. Now, let's think about this. This is, 7 months before October 7th. He was saying that the security of Israel was being threatened by the fact that Netanyahu was pushing for judicial reform because it was distracting politicians from what really mattered. It was causing upheaval in Israeli society. There were fighter pilots in the Air Force who were refusing to do their training flights out of protest. So it really was threatening the security of Israel, as Gallant claimed, and Netanyahu was very upset that Gallant was publicly calling him out in front of the nation. And so he fired Yoav Gallant. He just fired him. And many Israelis, myself included, thought this was absurd because he was the guy who was entrusted with Israeli security, the Minister of Defense. His portfolio is to keep the country safe. And here he was saying that the country is not safe because of judicial reform. And how does Netanyahu respond? He fires him. And so this led to massive, massive protests in Israel. I think that very night in March, more than 10,000 people took this to the street in Tel Aviv. And within a few days, Netanyahu gave Gallant his job back and reinstated him as Minister of Defense. But it was a humiliating political blow to Netanyahu. And ever since, those two have really been at odds. So what happened this week? A few days ago, Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense, got on television, prime time, and gave a press conference to the entire nation where he said unequivocally that because of Netanyahu's lack of a plan for a day after, once again, Israel's security is threatened. And what Gallant said is that immediately we need to fill the vacuum that exists in Gaza. And what he said needs to be done is to take non-Hamas Palestinians and put them in power, in control of the various districts and neighborhoods and cities in Gaza. Otherwise, with no one there to take control, there would be a vacuum, and that vacuum would naturally be filled either by Hamas or by Israel. Israel would have to take responsibility for governing in the Gaza Strip. And another thing Yoav Gallant said in his speech was that it was absolutely unacceptable that Israel would rule 2 million Gazans in the Gaza Strip, that on his watch, he could not permit Israel to be the ones who would have to govern Gaza. We did govern in Gaza until 2005. Many soldiers died. It was a tax on the army. It was a tax literally on the Israeli public. In 2005, Ariel Sharon pulled out of Gaza. And ever since then, for 13 of the years since then, Netanyahu has been the prime minister. And on his watch, we have seen what's happened to Hamas. So Gallant was really calling Netanyahu out and saying, we need to put non-Hamas Palestinians in charge of these areas of Gaza. Otherwise, Hamas will fill the vacuum. And he said that politicians need to make tough decisions, including those that go against their own political interests. Really not even mincing words and implying strongly that Netanyahu is making decisions based on his own political interests, not on the well-being of the country. So this is the backdrop for all of this, that the Minister of Defense, the one who knows the situation regarding security more than anyone else, is coming out and saying that Israel's security is being harmed by the fact that there is this vacuum in Gaza. So that leads us to our second narrative. What is happening because of this vacuum in Gaza? Well, Sinwar, one of our goals of this war is to get the Hamas leadership, including Sinwar. Sinwar is the architect of the October 7th attacks. As I can remind you, I've mentioned before, he was sitting in an Israeli jail until 2011. In 2011, Israel released more than 1,000 Palestinian terrorists, about a third of whom had blood on their hands, had actually murdered Israeli Jews. And they released over 1,000 of them in exchange for one tank soldier named Gilad Shalit, who had been kidnapped in 2006 and sat in Gaza for 5 years as a hostage. In 2011, Israel released these over 1,000 prisoners. One of them was Sinwar, and he went on now to become the architect of the October 7th attacks. And one of our objectives of this war was to get Sinwar. And many, many times, Netanyahu has said that dead or alive, we have Sinwar in our sights. We are going to get him. And so far, we have not. And until recently, we had very strong intelligence that he was in Rafah. But over this past week, it's come out that Sinwar is no longer in Rafah. To remind you, Rafiah, is the southernmost big city in Gaza along the border with Egypt. Many have said it's really the last stronghold that Israel needs to conquer in order to wipe out Hamas. There are 6 battalions of Hamas militants remaining. 4 of those are in Rafiah. And until recently, Sinwar was there as well. However, he is no longer there. And one of the reasons he is no longer there is because there is this vacuum in these other areas of Gaza that Israel has already conquered. Northern Gaza, central Gaza. Israel had finished the job and had taken control of these areas, but then pulled out, leaving an empty space. And Hamas has come back into these empty spaces, and Sinwar, using the tunnel networks, has been able to get back to, we now believe, central Gaza. So this is another consequence that the one leader of October 7th that we really wanted to nab, both for security reasons and for symbolic reasons, is no longer even hiding out in the city where he was before. And another reason he's no longer there is that Netanyahu has threatened many, many times to go into Rafah. Remember, the original ultimatum is that if by Ramadan we did not have all the hostages back, we would go into Rafah during Ramadan. And this was in early March. It's already 2 months ago. So Netanyahu has been broadcasting for a long time. We're going into Rafah. We're going into Rafah. And the fact that we didn't, all it did is warn Hamas that we're coming and allowed them to make plans for our eventual entry, including getting Sinwar out, including getting their militias ready. And really, it just gave them a bunch of lead time to prepare. You know, the biggest weapon in war is not the bomb, it's not the rifle, it's not the bullet or the tank. It's the element of surprise. And we totally removed the element of surprise by broadcasting over and over that we are going into Rafah 2 months ago. We gave them 60 days to prepare. So that's the second element of the story, is that the leadership, Sinwar, is no longer there. The third element of the story, which ties into what I brought in earlier, is that our soldiers now need to go back into these areas of Gaza that we'd already finished, supposedly, and refight these wars again. Now, the number of Hamas militants there is not as large as it was before, but it's still a challenge for IDF soldiers. And what we're seeing happen is that soldiers are now going back into Zeitoun, which is in central Gaza, and also this past week into Jabaliya, which is a city, but also a very large refugee camp in northern Gaza. And even on this podcast before, I reported how we'd already finished with those two areas, Zeitoun and Jabaliya, and that they were finished, and it was a victory for the IDF that we were able to move on. However, by not having any leadership there to patrol these neighborhoods, to watch over what was happening since we left, Hamas has been able to move in once again, and we are now fighting again in central and in northern Gaza. And this relates to the deaths of the 5 soldiers that I mentioned earlier. These 5 soldiers who were killed just about 36 hours ago. It's been discovered that the circumstances of their death were as follows. They were 5 paratroopers, and they were in a building. They were setting up sort of their base inside an abandoned apartment building in Jabaliya in northern Gaza, and they were accompanied by a number of tanks. And this is how it works in urban warfare. I was in the tanks myself in the 188th Armored Brigade. And in urban warfare, you always pair infantry and tanks together, because tanks, we have very sophisticated night vision that we can fire at targets 2 kilometers away. We can lock onto our targets so the cannon of the tank will actually follow a moving target, and using heat, have our missile fire directly. You want to have your infantry backed up by tanks. However, there was some sort of miscommunication, and one of the tanks working with these paratroopers fired 2 missiles at the building that the paratroopers were stationed in, killing these 5 soldiers and injuring 7 more, a few of them very seriously. This is what's called in English friendly fire. I mean, that's a horrible expression. We need a better one, because there's absolutely nothing, friendly or remotely pleasant about it. In Hebrew, we call it a dutz. That's the slang word in the army. Dutz means yeri du tzdadi, meaning a 2-sided firing, meaning you're firing from the same side. And this was a dutz. This was IDF soldiers killing, by accident, 5 other IDF soldiers. And one of the things that is come out in the story is that these tank soldiers, like so many soldiers in Gaza, are just exhausted and are stressed mentally. I can't say I blame these tank soldiers for firing because in the fog of war, when you are not sleeping and when you are stressed and afraid, it is very easy to make these mistakes. However, the fact is that because they are so exhausted and stressed, these kinds of mistakes are happening. And one of the reasons that they are so overworked is because we now have to fight the war a second time. We now have to go into these parts of Gaza that we had already conquered and finished and go back in and fight again. And the deaths of these 5 soldiers under the circumstances that they died, killed by fellow IDF soldiers who were tired, overworked, stressed, it's really waking up the Israeli public to the idea that this day after plan, it's not just a nice concept that we need to put in place, but it's having consequences right now. The fact that there is no plan on the ground for how to fill the vacuum when the IDF is victorious over a city and then we leave. If we're not going to put any leadership there, it's leading to Hamas coming right back. So that leads us to the question is, why are we not filling this vacuum? Why is Netanyahu and the leadership not doing anything? Well, I assure you, Yoav Gallant and the other 2 members of the war cabinet who are siding with him, Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, who are both former chiefs of staff, they want to see some sort of leadership there that is non-Israeli, that is non-Hamas Palestinian. It could be Palestinian Authority. We would work with our partners in the world, America, maybe some of the Arab countries, to instill some sort of leadership that's non-Hamas. This benefits everyone. But Netanyahu is refusing to do it. Why is that? Well, we can guess. One reason is simply that he wants the war to go on as long as possible to keep himself in power, and I think that's part of it. But I think we can drill down and actually give a more specific answer. And the reason is the way Israel's government works, it's coalition-based. In the 120-member Knesset, the legislature, you need a majority of at least 61 to remain in power. And right now, Netanyahu has a majority of 64. But that includes some very right-wing extremist politicians who he would never be friends with in his former incarnation. But right now, in order to stay elected, to stay in power, he needs to be friends with. I'm talking about Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, Ben Gvir, the minister of the police, other right-wing politicians who are very extreme. And they want Israel to return to Gaza. They want Gaza to be Israeli territory. The same way we've heard our enemies talk about the river to the sea, they also want Israel to be from the river to the sea, all of it, greater Israel. And that includes Gaza. So Netanyahu cannot come out and publicly say that he wants any type of leadership in Gaza other than Israel. Now, he is not publicly saying that he thinks Israel should rule Gaza, but he's not publicly saying that there should be some other form of leadership there, because he needs to keep these right-wing extremists in the Knesset, in his coalition, happy. Otherwise, they will ditch him. And Israelis are once again realizing, and I agree, my original intention was not to be political in this podcast, but since then I found it's impossible. And you know my opinion by now. I'm very against Netanyahu in this even more strongly. And when I say against Netanyahu, I want to drive home how many Israelis feel. And these aren't just, sort of centrist, liberal, progressive Israelis like myself. This is former and current Likud party backers, religious Jews with the kippah sruga, the knit yarmulke. It really is all segments of Israeli society who are upset with Netanyahu. And when I say upset, it's not just frustrated. It's the same way nature abhors a vacuum. Many Israelis abhor Netanyahu. They are furious. They are sickened by him because they see that their children are dying in Gaza because of his unwillingness to do something that will threaten his own ability to stay in power. He's playing with our children's lives and with our lives. That's how many Israelis feel, and I agree with that. So there's a lot of frustration in Israel right now. Now, what will change? What's going to happen? I don't know. Supposedly, there was a conversation between Gallant, the defense minister, and Netanyahu about this public press conference that Gallant gave. I think Netanyahu remembers what happened last time he fired Yoav Gallant, and don't expect that he would do that again. But this is a big story in Israel. The fact that the Minister of Defense is calling out the Prime Minister. And I should add one other element is that the Chief of Staff, Halevi, he also supposedly got in a shouting match with Netanyahu this week, telling Netanyahu that he was putting the army in an impossible situation. And he actually used the metaphor of the Greek Sisyphus, right? The guy who's pushing the boulder up the mountain forever. He said that this is the situation the IDF is in right now. You're having us push a boulder up the mountain indefinitely by having us fight in Gaza, leaving a neighborhood victorious, and then going back to fight in those same neighborhoods again. And this will go on and on forever unless we fill the vacuum. And Netanyahu was furious at being called out by the chief of staff in this meeting, but it leaked to the press. And so, look, we are seeing that those who know defense best are now publicly criticizing Netanyahu. So those are the stories relating to the vacuum and how Israelis really see this vacuum as impacting their lives. One other item before I move on to the news of the week is that of those 5 soldiers who were killed, one of them is a lone soldier from Argentina. And his parents, I think as we speak, are on a plane right now from Buenos Aires to Israel for the funeral. The other 4 soldiers have already been buried, but this one soldier, who's a lone soldier from Argentina, has not been buried yet because his family only was notified recently, and they are currently on the way. And obviously, this touches me a little more personally because I myself was a lone soldier in the IDF. I know what that's like to join voluntarily and to have your family so far away. And we can only imagine what his family is going through right now. Okay. On to the news for the week. There are a lot of stories that we could have used as our 3 main news stories. I'm going to pick out 3 that I'm not going to go into very deeply, but just sort of read the headlines. One of them, the United Nations today held a meeting for the first time only about the plight of Israeli hostages. Kind of incredible that 7.5 months after October 7th, today is the first time the United Nations held a meeting only about the hostages, not connected to aid for the Gazan population, not connected to war crimes against Israel, only for the plight of the hostages. It took 7.5 months. What will come out of it? Nothing. Okay. Next story, Jew-on-Jew violence. I've talked about that a lot, how I see that one of Israel's biggest threats is violence, one Jew on another. I've said that I wouldn't even be surprised if an Israeli politician is at some point assassinated over the next 5 years, as we talk about pulling out of the West Bank, having some sort of 2-state solution. I hope I'm wrong. Really, God forbid that I would be right on this. But when you see what's happening to Israeli society right now, it makes me believe that this is actually a possibility. And we did see something happen today, which many of you will probably be surprised to hear, that a group of Jewish settlers attacked Israeli soldiers in the West Bank. These Jewish settlers, they're part of the Hilltop movement, Hilltop Youth movement. They're extremist settlers. They often settle on areas that are illegal in the West Bank, taking land from Palestinians illegally. They attacked a truck being driven by a Palestinian, and were attempting to loot the truck, thinking that it was aid destined for Gaza. And the IDF came to protect the driver and to give him first aid. And because they were protecting the driver and giving him first aid, these Jewish settlers attacked IDF soldiers, injuring a number of them. So you're seeing Jew-on-Jew violence, and sadly, I don't expect this to dissipate, at least not with this government in power. Last little news item I'll bring up is that South Africa is bringing new charges against Israel at the International Court of Justice. You can read all about this online. I have nothing to add except, really, South Africa? Are you kidding me? Once again, this is their second time. I don't know, what's the right word? Horrified? Miffed? Just, what's the world coming to? South Africa? You serious? All right, these are the news stories I do want to dive into a little bit. One of them is that the United Nations reduced the numbers of women and children killed in Gaza by 50%. So up until now, the United Nations was saying that 10,000 women have been killed in Gaza, and now they revised that number to about 5,000. And they had been saying that 15,000 children had been killed in Gaza and revised it to about 8,000. Now, don't get me wrong, 13,000 women and children dead is not a good thing. And I guarantee you, just about every Israeli agrees with that as well. We are not going into Gaza in order to kill civilians. We don't want to. It's bad for them. And it's bad for us. One of the reasons we have so much PTSD among our soldiers is because of the numbers of civilian deaths. We are not an army that prides itself in killing civilians. We take it seriously. However, this does relate to this bigger issue of how the deaths are reported. You know, deaths coming out of Gaza are always reported. They're relying on the Hamas-run Ministry of Health. And once you hear Hamas, it just shows that you cannot trust these numbers. But the world eats them up and takes these numbers as if they're being given by the Surgeon General of the United States or something. I mean, they eat it hook, line, and sinker. And now we're hearing that these numbers are actually half as large as they'd been reported before. Now, quickly, there was all this backlash where the UN was saying, no, the actual number of deaths is actually the same. And they started giving all these excuses about who we've identified as dead and who we haven't identified as yet. But the bottom line remains that this is a clear slap in the face to the world that, hey, all these numbers you've been eating and not even questioning, they're actually not true. They're actually inflated. They're twice as big as they had been reported. I should also point out that Hamas counts anyone under the age of 18 as a child. So when we talk about children dying in Gaza, we're not just talking about babies, 5 years old. We're talking about teenagers, 15, 16, 17 years old, many of whom are fighters in Hamas, who are armed, who are launching rockets, who are taking part in Hamas militant activities. So you know, these children statistics, a lot of these are Hamas militants that are simply getting reported as children, and of course the world eats it up. We also had video released this week of Hamas interacting with United Nations trucks. You can go online and look at this. It's kind of fascinating. You see United Nations trucks with the UN on the roof. The reason UN is painted on the roof of their cars and trucks is that so Israel, when they're bombing, will not bomb them because they can read UN. However, what we're seeing is that Hamas is working with the United Nations. The United Nations is enabling Hamas. They're in partnership. They're working together. We already saw this with UNRWA, United Nations WRA something. I'm a little too tired to remember this. Relief something. It's been a long day, but that they had some of their members participating in attacks on October 7th. So, you know, what's obvious to us in Israel, the world is now seeing. Now, will it make a difference? You know, one of my friend, Harold, who was a former employee for Israel Bonds, wrote in saying, what do we do with this? How do we do a better job of getting the truth out? And he was writing from personal experience that this week in Philadelphia, there were protests outside of the Israel Bonds office and also at University of Pennsylvania. A lot of the arrests, it turned out, were not even students. I think most of the arrests. So Harold's question is, what can we do to get the truth out? I don't know how much this is on us to get the truth out. The truth is out there for anyone who wants to see it, who cares about the truth. I don't think most people, in at least the ones we're talking about, care about the truth. I still think most Americans support Israel over Hamas. We had those polls showing 80% of Americans, given the choice between Israel and Hamas, support Israel. And I would imagine that still holds true. I would also imagine that these images of masked, not just students, but protesters taking over campus buildings violently and leaving supposed dolls that look like dead bodies on the lawns of University of Michigan regents and invading their privacy. Most people don't like this. Most people don't like the idea of Muslim masked Hamas-looking militants roaming through their neighborhoods. So, you know, what we're seeing in terms of anti-Israel protests in the media, I said this last week as well, I don't think it necessarily reflects all the true numbers of those who are anti-Israel. And I think Biden could be miscalculating here, putting too much weight on trying to satisfy his progressive wing and not realizing just how many people actually are horrified by these, by what's going on campuses. You know, only 8% of college students actually participated in these protests against Israel. You would think it were 70%, the way the images are coming out and seeing all these tents. And I think there could be a miscalculation here. I know a lot of Jews who are saying to me that they're not sure they're going to vote Democratic the way they usually have. It's not an automatic choice. They don't want to vote for Trump, but they don't see a vote necessarily for not just Biden, but for the future of the Democratic Party. So they're considering not voting at all or voting for Kennedy, which is essentially, I think, a vote for Trump. So November is up for grabs as well. And I think Biden is making a mistake forgetting who truly could be supporting him and sort of miscalculating based on what he's seeing in the media. In any case, these are the revised United Nations numbers. To me, that's a big story. Second big story, we've talked many times about the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim in Israel. How do they do not serve in the Israeli army. Last year alone, 2023, 66,000 ultra-Orthodox Israeli Jews were given exemptions from serving in the IDF. Meanwhile, 18-year-old Israelis were told that if they're in a combat unit, they need to serve 4 months longer than they'd signed up for. They were drafted for 2 years, 8 months. Their service was extended to 3 months. The age for military reserve duty was raised so that people are serving in the reserves longer. Meanwhile, the ultra-Orthodox are not serving. And today, or yesterday, Netanyahu put forth a bill that supposedly would have solved the problem. But when you look at the bill, it does absolutely nothing to solve the problem. And it's very confusing. I had to read it a few times and research it to try to make sense of it. Here's basically what this idea would posit. It would lower the exemption age from the IDF from 26 years old to 21 years old. I'm going to say that one more time. Ultra-Orthodox Jews right now are exempt from serving in the army until the age of 26. It would lower that age to 21. So what does that actually do on the ground? And this is what I didn't understand and had to really look into. What this means is that until now, and still right now, ultra-Orthodox Israeli Jews need to stay in a yeshiva, until the age of 26 in order to be exempt from the military. And then after that, they can enter the workforce. But this new bill would lower the age to 21, meaning that they need to stay in yeshiva only until the age of 21 in order to avoid being in the military. And then they could enter the workforce. In other words, it says absolutely nothing about actually being drafted into the army. It simply lowers the age of exemption from 26 to 21. If anything, this is actually good for the ultra-Orthodox because it means they don't have to stay in yeshiva until they're 26. They can only stay until they're 21 and then are exempt from the army for life and can enter the workforce. Now, only 50% of ultra-Orthodox Jewish men are actually in the workforce. So I'm not sure exactly what that means logistically in terms of what they would do. Many of them would probably stay in yeshiva anyway because they do get subsidies for that. In any case, the point is Netanyahu's proposal would absolutely do nothing to actually solve the problem of having the ultra-Orthodox serve. And he was called out on that immediately by Benny Gantz, who actually had originally proposed this bill several years ago in 2022 under different circumstances. And that's what Netanyahu said is, hey, Gantz, this was your bill. But Gantz said, hey, remember, in 2022, we didn't have the security situation and issues that we do right now. And everyone immediately saw that this was just a political trick by Netanyahu. The attorney general sent it back to him saying it is not a viable option. And there's a lot of backlash in Israeli society, especially because this would come out on the same day that 5 soldiers were killed by fellow IDF soldiers who are overworked, overtired, overstressed, because we're short on manpower right now. And one reason we're short on manpower is because the ultra-Orthodox don't serve. So this story, to be continued, but something's got to give at some point. And it's another reason I think there could be Jew-on-Jew violence, because if they are ultimately drafted, you will see an uprising from the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community and not just signs sitting on the sidewalk. You'll see violence. You heard it here first. All right, last news story. Not so huge, but I think significant because it brings up an idea. This is the canceling of events that involve Israel around the world. There was a well-known string quartet scheduled to perform in Amsterdam, and their concert was canceled because it's for Israelis. There's a soccer match to be held in Belgium, I believe, between the Israeli team and a Belgium team, and that was canceled or put on hold, postponed, because it was an Israeli team. And now this quartet concert was actually reinstated because there was so much backlash against the idea that we're canceling Israeli musicians that actually it was reinstated and the concert is going to happen anyway. But you are seeing more and more of these types of events. I know the musician Matisyahu has several of his concerts canceled, and there are other Israeli groups. And it just makes me wonder if eventually enough people will lose money, producers, concert venues, stadiums, team owners, that eventually enough of them are going to lose money from all these events involving Israelis being canceled that they might actually start coming out against the idea of canceling these events, that they might actually start coming out in favor of having these events with Israel. Oftentimes it takes the economic pressure in order for something to happen. Global warming, of when enough companies start seeing their bottom lines affected by global warming, then they will start supporting legislation to combat global warming. In the same way, when enough events are canceled with Israelis that start losing money for venues, for owners, producers, I'm wondering if this could be one of the sort of solutions. One of the ways that this might backfire is that when actually it hits the pocketbooks of those who stand to make a profit, that could start leading to more support for Israel. Maybe I'm wrong. Just an idea I wanted to put out there. All right. Let's go on to our questions. So first question comes from Iris. I'm not sure where Iris is. Her question is, how did 1,000 Hamas terrorists get to Turkey to be treated in Turkish hospitals? Now, I'm not going to lie to you. I didn't know what Iris was talking about. I didn't know this story, so I had to look it up. But lo and behold, there's plenty out there about it. So I'll give you some of the details. Apparently, the Prime Minister of Turkey, who is very anti-Israel, his name, if I'm saying it correctly, is Erdogan. He's very anti-Israel, has come out supporting Hamas, has said that Hamas leadership can shelter there if they leave Qatar. And he bragged that Turkey is treating 1,000 Hamas militants. That's how much they support Hamas. That was later apparently revised by other Turkish officials saying, actually, it's not Hamas necessarily. It could be Gazan civilians who are being treated in Turkish hospitals. But as to Iris's question, how did they actually get there? I don't know. And I looked to try to find you an answer, Iris. I'm always willing to say I don't know when I don't. And here's one of those cases where I don't. It could be that there actually aren't 1,000 there, that this is simply a brag, but it's not actually true. Or it could be that they've gotten some out in some way that I wasn't able to find. But that's the story. I think more important here is the backstory. The fact that Turkey has really become so virulently anti-Israel. Israelis used to vacation in Turkey. I've been to Turkey myself, used to fly Turkish Airlines, never will again. But Turkey recently ended all trade with Israel, and I think within the last 24 hours, Israel imposed a 100% tax on all Turkish imports. Frankly, I don't know what we're importing from Turkey, so I'm not sure what those items are. I do know that a not small number of Israeli men fly to Turkey for hair transplant treatments. When you're in the airport in Istanbul, you'll see a lot of men from all over the world with bandages on their heads. And I guess there's some sort of special surgery that is done in Turkey to help bald men have the hair they want. And I know many Israelis who've gone there for this kind of treatment. And I don't know if that's going to continue. But in any case, Israel's imposing a 100% tax on Turkish imports. And, I hope this hurts Turkey more than it hurts us. I really do. I think anyone who doesn't trade with Israel ultimately will suffer because we bring so much amazing technology and other products to the world. Also medical products. All these people who call for boycotts, I don't think they quite realize what they're giving up when they say they're boycotting Israeli products. So I hope this comes back to bite Turkey in the ass. That's my wish. Next question. This is from, I'm going to give him a different name because it's a high school student. I'm going to call him Ruvi. And this is a student at a day school where I spoke earlier this week in New Jersey on Yom Ha'atzmaut. I gave a talk on ethics in the Israeli army. And he wrote me an email afterwards saying, Joel, I want to join the IDF, although I also want to go to yeshiva in Israel for my gap year after high school. I am, Be'ezrat Hashem, going to Israel this summer for the very first time. I've never been before. Do you think there are any life lessons that you learned from being in the Israeli army? And what I wanted to point out about this question is I hear this kind of thing a lot. I get emails from high school students or college students saying, I want to join the Israeli army. I've never been to Israel, or I've been once on a birthright trip, and then asking me for advice. And what I told Ruvi is what I tell everyone else is you cannot just join the army having never been to the country or having been there on a birthright trip for 10 days, or even frankly, having been there for a 6-week team tour over the summer. You need a minimum of 6 months, probably a year, to live in the country, to see if you can actually handle not just the country itself, but Israelis. Israelis are a different breed. Before I joined the Israeli army, my wife, Dorit, tried to talk me out of it. She was then my girlfriend. She said, Yoel, the Israelis in the Israeli army aren't the nice, sweet Israelis they send to Camp Ramah every summer. In the army, you'll meet the real Israelis, and they will eat you alive. And luckily, I joined the army anyway. I didn't listen to her, but I know what she means, that we get this impression that Israeli soldiers are all these brave, sweet lions of Judah who want nothing more than to defend the Jewish people. And they're all like the Israelis who come to Camp Young Judea and Camp Ramah over the summer, leading us in their pioneer songs. But Israel's a tough country, and Israelis are a tough people. I love them. I've lived there now for 7 years in this second go, and I finally feel Israeli myself. And I love the Israeli mentality, and I feel myself becoming more Israeli every day. But they're a tough people, and if you've never lived there, you don't know what you're in for. So you can't just join the Israeli army because it's a sexy idea or because you think you're going to be a hero. You need to know what you're getting yourself into. Live in Israel a while. Get your Hebrew up to speed. Talk to other soldiers and listen carefully to what it's like, and talk to lone soldiers. Every lone soldier is at some point unhappy. I've done many shows and talks for lone soldiers in Israel, and many, many of them are unhappy at some point, and that's natural. The army is hard. I cry just about every day. It was hell. Now, I look back and I'm glad I did it, but you got to know what you're getting yourself into. But I wanted to bring this question up because it's a common one. And there is this misconception that by joining up, you automatically become this sort of brave Lion of Judah Israeli soldier that we've always looked up to. And it's much more complicated than that. Last question. This one's from Donna from Atlantic City, New Jersey. And she writes, I love questions like this. When is a person considered Israeli? I get that you can only be a Sabra if you're born in Israel, but is someone considered Israeli as soon as they've made Aliyah, which means move to Israel? Are you called Israeli American if you were born in the US, or does that also apply if you're an Israeli and moved to America? I don't know any Israelis who live in America who call themselves Israeli Americans. I know plenty of Americans who live in Israel who call themselves Israeli Americans or American Israelis. I think it's only one directional. As for your question about when is a person considered Israeli, I mean, there's a lot of layers to that question. Technically, when are you Israeli? The moment you land in Israel to make Aliyah, to immigrate, you get a passport or at least a Teudat Oleh, an Aliyah certificate in the airport, and you are Israeli. There's no acclimation process. You don't have to earn anything for 6 months or 3 months or whatever. You are Israeli the minute you land in Ben Gurion and get that Teudat Oleh in your hand. I think a much bigger question is, when do you feel like an Israeli? I made a video this past week with my friend Benji Lovett, whom I wrote Israel 201 with, and it's on Instagram right now. If you're on Instagram, you should check it out. It's called Yay, Now I'm Israeli. It's sort of a comedic video where we interviewed all these immigrants to Israel about the moment they knew that they were Israeli. And it was funny. None of them said it was the moment I landed and got my passport. They said things like when I was in the supermarket and I asked the person in front of me if I could cut in line because I only had one or two items and they had several. Someone said when I pulled my car over to the side of the road and just peed right there next to the highway, I knew I was Israeli. Another woman said, when my son went into the Israeli army, then I knew I was really an Israeli. So, in Benji himself, he had a great one. He said, when I told a joke in Hebrew and people laughed, that was his moment when he knew he was Israeli. For me, I said it was when I dreamed in Hebrew. I still remember the night in basic training, the first time I had a dream and it was in Hebrew and I actually understood what was going on. For me, that was my Israeli moment. So I think, Donna, you're tapping into something much more deeply psychological here. It's not just about when you get the stamp in your passport or that teudat oleh. It's about when do you feel Israeli? And there are certainly moments when you do, but there are also many moments when you realize you never will feel fully Israeli. I think it's true for me that no matter how long I live there, how many kids I put through the army, two already, one this summer is going to be interviewed, and another one in a few years. I'll never be fully Israeli. There's a part of me that will always be a good old Midwesterner who apologizes for things, who wants to keep things smooth and diplomatic, and is worried about other people's feelings. And, the way I see other things as well, whether it's politics, money, uh, Judaism, those are elements that my Americanness might permeate and stay with me a long time. So it's really a bigger question of what does it mean to be Israeli? That is all for this week. I want to thank you all for joining me. This was a lot of fun tonight, and I think we touched on some deep questions and deep issues, but nevertheless, it's very meaningful to me to be able to share it with you. As always, if you want the links to these live webinars, you get those through my newsletter, which is at joelchasnoff.com/podcast. Just put in your email in that box, sign up for the newsletter, and you'll get a link every Thursday with these links for the webinar. And you'll also get Hebrew is Magic, which is my newsletter about Hebrew words. If you can't listen or make these live webinars, listen on Apple and on Spotify. The links to Apple and Spotify are on that page I just put above, joelchasnoff.com/podcast. Finally, I want to mention that Benji and I are going on a comedy tour next fall. It's called Latkes and Laughter, and the idea is to tie in Hanukkah with some comedy shows. Now, it's true. Hanukkah doesn't start until Christmas, December 25th, I believe, of next year. But we're going to be doing this show in November and December. The idea is to bring a little holiday cheer to the Jewish people. With all we've been through, don't we need to laugh? And yes, we do. We're not saying forget all the hard stuff. We're saying put it aside for 1 hour. So if you're interested in that tour and bringing us to your communities, again, really simple. Just go to joelchasnoff.com and you'll see all the information on the comedy page. That is it for right now. I really appreciate your joining Inside Israel this week. I'm Joel Chasnoff. Next week, we will be meeting once again on Thursday night. That is the 23rd of May, and I'll be coming to you from home in Israel. I look forward to bringing you that insider perspective next week. Until then, hit me up with your questions. Give me any feedback you've got. I'd always love to hear it. And Rak Shalom, only peace for all of us. I'll leave the chat open for a couple of minutes so you can hang out. Toda Rabah.